What if everything you were taught about discipline is wrong? Not slightly wrong, completely, biologically, scientifically wrong. You've tried, you've set alarms, you've made lists, you've told yourself this time is different, and still, somewhere between the intention and the action, something breaks, and you end up exactly where you started, maybe with a little more guilt on top. Here's what nobody tells you: that feeling of failure. It's not about character, it's about wiring. Your brain was never built for the kind of discipline modern life demands, and the moment you understand why, everything changes. Every protocol and insight shared on this channel is reviewed by a clinical pharmacist and researcher. So what you're about to hear isn't motivation, it's science, applied, practical, and designed for real life. Stay with me for the next hour, because by the end of this video, you won't just know what to do differently. You'll understand yourself in a way you never have before, and that changes everything. Let me ask you something honest. How many times have you told yourself, "This time it's different"? You set the alarm, you made the list, you had the plan. Maybe you even bought the journal, the app, the book, and for a few days, maybe even a week, it worked. You felt it, the momentum. The version of yourself you always knew was in there. And then something happened. Not a dramatic collapse, not a single bad decision, just a gradual fade. One skipped morning, one missed workout, one night of scrolling instead of sleeping. And before you even noticed, the whole thing had quietly unraveled, like a sweater pulled by a loose thread. If that sounds familiar, you are not broken. And you are not weak. You are simply someone who has been handed the wrong tool for the job and told it was your fault when it didn't work. That tool is willpower, and we need to talk about it. For decades, willpower has been sold to us as the ultimate currency of personal success. If you struggle, try harder. If you fail, want it more. The whole productivity industry, the journals, the morning routines, the cold plunges, the 5 a.m. clubs, is built on the silent assumption that if you just push yourself hard enough, long enough, your behavior will change permanently. But here is what neuroscience has been quietly showing us for years. Willpower is a finite resource. It depletes. Like a muscle exhausted by overuse, it weakens throughout the day. Every decision you make, from what to have for breakfast to how to respond to an email, draws from the same cognitive reserve. By evening, the reserve is nearly empty, and your brain, desperately seeking recovery, reaches for the most familiar comfort it can find. Roy Baumeister, a psychologist at Florida State University, called this phenomenon ego depletion, the idea that self-regulation shares its energy with other mental tasks. The more decisions you make, the less capacity you have to regulate your behavior. And while some of the specifics of his research have been debated and refined over the years, the core observation stands in lived experience, across cultures, across demographics, across age groups. Willpower alone does not hold. Think about the last time you had a genuinely exhausting day. A day where you handled problems, made judgment calls, managed other people's emotions, solved things that didn't want to be solved, and then it was evening. What happened? Did you come home and naturally default to your best behaviors? Or did you reach for something easy, food that wasn't planned, a screen that numbed the noise, a version of yourself that just needed to stop trying? That's not a character flaw. That's a biological response. The brain, at the end of a high-demand day, conserves what's left. It retreats to default. And the default is whatever has been done most often, most automatically, most effortlessly in the past. This is the core problem with relying on willpower as your primary strategy. It only works when conditions are ideal. When you're rested, when motivation is high, when the environment cooperates, when nothing else has drained you. But life, real life, the life of someone over 40 with responsibilities, history, and genuine demands, is almost never operating under ideal conditions. There's something even more unsettling though. The moments when we most need willpower, when temptation is highest, when the craving is strongest, when the easier path is most seductive, are precisely the moments when willpower is at its lowest. This is not irony. It is design. The brain is exquisitely calibrated to conserve energy, and resisting a strong pull takes enormous energy. So the system, paradoxically, fails exactly when you need it most, and yet we keep trying. We tell ourselves we'll be stronger tomorrow. We start fresh on Monday. We wait for the right season, the right mood, the right motivation. We treat our behavior like a problem of character, when it is actually a problem of architecture. James Clear puts it plainly. When you have to rely on motivation to act, the system is already broken. Because motivation is a feeling, and feelings are weather. They shift, they're unreliable. Building a disciplined life on motivation is like building a house on sand. It may stand for a while, but one storm, and it's gone. So if willpower fades and motivation fluctuates, what is left? Structure, systems, the quiet, invisible architecture of your daily environment. And here is where something genuinely shifts. Because once you understand that your failures were not about weakness, that they were, in fact, a rational response to a badly designed situation, the guilt loses its grip. You are no longer fighting yourself. You are redesigning the game. And that, as you will see in the next part, makes all the difference in the world. There is a cafeteria in a hospital in the northeastern United States. A few years ago, researchers made one single change to that cafeteria. They moved the water bottles. That's it. No campaign, no posters, no nutritional education, no incentives or penalties. They simply placed the water at eye level, at the front of every station, and moved the sodas to the back of the shelves and the bottom of the coolers. Water consumption went up significantly. Soda sales dropped. And not one person in that cafeteria consciously decided to make a healthier choice. They simply reached for what was closest. Now sit with that for a moment. Because what that study reveals is something far more confronting than a dietary statistic. It tells us that the majority of our daily decisions, the ones we think we are making freely, rationally, consciously, are not really decisions at all. They are responses. Automatic, reflexive, almost mechanical responses to whatever our environment has placed in front of us. And if that's true in a cafeteria, it's true in your kitchen. It's true in your bedroom. It's true in your office. It's true everywhere your behavior unfolds. You are not as in control as you believe, and that is not an insult. It is an invitation. Think about your mornings. Not the mornings you planned, but the mornings that actually happened. The phone that was already on the nightstand, already buzzing, already pulling your attention before your feet hit the floor. The coffee machine that was 3 steps from the bedroom, already set to brew. The news app that opened itself, as if by gravity. The couch that seemed to arrange itself in exactly the right angle of comfort and light. None of those things required a decision. They simply happened, because your environment made them happen. Now think about the behaviors you've been trying to build, the book you want to read, the workout you want to start, the quiet morning ritual you've imagined 100 times. How much friction stands between you and those things? Where are they in your physical space? Are they visible, accessible, unavoidable? Or are they tucked away, buried, effortful to even locate? The difference between the behavior you want and the behavior you have is, in many cases, nothing more than distance. Friction. Architecture. This concept has a name in behavioral economics: choice architecture. And it refers to the way in which the design of an environment, what is visible, what is accessible, what comes first, what requires effort, shapes the decisions people make, often without awareness. The architects of our choices are not always other people or corporations. More often, they are us, or rather, the version of us that set up the environment in the first place. The problem is that most of us set up our environments to serve comfort, not growth. We arrange our spaces for ease, for pleasure, for the path of least resistance right now, not for the person we are trying to become. And then we are surprised when the environment produces the same person, day after day, Here is a reframe that may feel uncomfortable but is worth holding. Your environment is always teaching you how to behave. Every single day, it is running a training program. The question is not whether it is shaping you, it is whether it is shaping you toward the life you actually want. The researchers Thaler and Sunstein, who won a Nobel Prize for their work on behavioral economics, introduced the concept of the nudge. The idea that small, subtle changes to the environment can produce large, lasting changes in behavior without restricting freedom or relying on discipline at all. A nudge doesn't force, it doesn't punish, it doesn't demand. It simply makes the right choice, the easy choice. And you can do this for yourself, deliberately, intentionally. Like an engineer designing a system rather than a person fighting a battle. Want to drink more water? Put a glass on your desk before you sit down. Want to read before bed? Place the book on your pillow in the morning. Want to stop reaching for your phone first thing? Charge it in a different room. Want to eat better? Rearrange your refrigerator so that the vegetables are at eye level and the less desirable options require a second reach. These are not dramatic interventions. They are not heroic. They will not make headlines. But compounded over weeks and months, they produce something willpower never could. Consistency that doesn't cost anything. There's a subtler point underneath all of this that is worth naming. Every time you rely on willpower to resist your environment, you are spending energy. Energy that could go toward your work, your relationships, your creativity, your health. The person who keeps the cigarettes in the house and relies on willpower not to smoke is spending far more than the person who simply does not keep cigarettes in the house. The friction is the protection. The design is the discipline. This is not about perfection. It is not about building a sterile, controlled life with no room for spontaneity. It is about recognizing that the spaces where you live and work are either your allies or your adversaries, and that you have more power over that than you may have ever realized. And once you understand that, a natural next question arises. If the environment can make good behavior easier, can you go one level deeper? Can you make good behavior not just easy, but automatic? Not just supported, but invisible? The answer is yes, and it involves something the brain already does brilliantly, all the time, without any effort at all. Right now, without thinking about it, your brain is running hundreds of programs simultaneously. Your posture, your breathing, the way you hold a cup, the route you take to the kitchen, the order in which you wash yourself in the shower, the side of the bed you sleep on, the exact sequence of things you do after you sit down at your desk. You didn't decide any of that this morning. You didn't consult a plan or summon motivation. It simply happened, smooth, effortless, automatic, because at some point in the past, your brain decided that these behaviors were reliable enough to be handed off to a lower level of processing, to free up the conscious mind for things that actually require attention. This is called automaticity, and it is one of the most powerful forces in human behavior. The brain is, at its core, a prediction machine. It is constantly looking for patterns it can recognize, compress, and automate. Because automation is efficiency, and efficiency is survival. Every time you repeat a behavior in a consistent context, the neural pathway associated with that behavior gets a little stronger, a little faster, a little more automatic. Until one day, the behavior no longer feels like a choice. It just happens. This is the mechanism behind every habit you have, good or bad. The morning coffee, the evening scroll, the way you respond to stress, the food you reach for when you're tired. None of these started as automatic. Every single one of them was, at some point, a deliberate choice. And then it was repeated in context, often enough that the brain decided, I'll handle this one. The question is not whether your brain will automate behaviors. It will. It does. Every day. The question is, which behaviors are you feeding into that system? And this is where one of the most elegant strategies in modern behavioral science becomes relevant. It's called habit stacking. And once you understand how it works, you will never think about building new habits the same way again. The concept, developed and popularized by James Clear, is straightforward in theory, but profound in practice. Rather than trying to insert a new habit into your life from scratch, which requires finding a cue, building a routine, and establishing a reward all from zero, you attach the new behavior to an existing one. You stack it onto a habit that is already automatic. Because here's what people miss when they try to build new habits. The hardest part is not doing the thing. The hardest part is starting, initiating, crossing the threshold between not doing and doing. That moment of activation requires a disproportionate amount of cognitive energy. It's the reason a run that takes 40 minutes to complete can take 3 hours to begin. But if you attach the new behavior to an existing habit, one that already happens reliably, without effort, without deliberation, you borrow the momentum of the old behavior to launch the new one. The existing habit becomes the cue. The trigger is already built in. The hardest part is already handled. The formula is simple. After I do X, I will do Y. After I pour my morning coffee, I will write 3 sentences in my journal. After I sit down at my desk, I will close all browser tabs and set a single intention for the next 90 minutes. After I brush my teeth at night, I will do 5 minutes of stretching. After I finish lunch, I will take a 10-minute walk before returning to work. Notice what these examples have in common. They are specific, they are brief, they are attached to behaviors that already happen consistently, and they require almost no activation energy, because the trigger is already in motion before the new behavior begins. Now, there is something important to understand about why this works at the neurological level. Habit loops operate through a 3-part sequence: cue, routine, reward. The cue triggers the routine produces the reward, and the reward reinforces the loop. When you stack a new habit onto an existing one, you are essentially inserting a new routine into a loop that already has a working cue and a proven reward system. The brain recognizes the cue, initiates the loop, and your new behavior gets carried along for the ride. Over time, with enough repetition, the stack itself becomes a single unit. The coffee becomes the cue not just for drinking, but for writing. The toothbrush becomes the cue not just for dental hygiene, but for reflection. The body begins to anticipate the second behavior before the first one is even finished. And that anticipation, that forward lean, is what transforms an intention into an identity. For someone over 40, this matters in a particular way. Because by this point in life, the nervous system has accumulated decades of deeply grooved habits, both the ones that serve you and the ones that quietly undermine you. Trying to change behavior through force, through discipline, through sheer determination, that is a young person's game, and even young people can't sustain it. What actually works, at any age, is working with the grain of the brain rather than against it. Think of the habits you already have in place: your morning routine, however it looks, your commute, your meals, your evenings. Each of these is a thread already woven into the fabric of your day. Habit stacking is simply the art of weaving in new threads alongside the ones already there, without tearing anything apart, without rebuilding from scratch, without requiring heroism. Small, specific, attached, consistent. That is the recipe. Not for a dramatic transformation overnight, but for something more durable, more honest, and ultimately more powerful. A life that slowly, quietly, inevitably becomes the one you intended to build. But here is a question worth sitting with. What happens when you design the environment, stack the habits, remove the friction, and still find yourself avoiding the thing? What happens when the obstacle is not outside you, but inside you? What happens when the enemy is not laziness, but something that looks and sounds exactly like reason? That is procrastination in its truest form. And it is far more sophisticated than you may have been led to believe. Let's talk about procrastination. Not the cartoon version, the person lying on the couch eating chips while deadlines burn. The real version. The one that looks, from the outside, almost indistinguishable from productivity. The real version is the person who cleans the entire kitchen before sitting down to write, who reorganizes their task list instead of starting the most important task on it, Who reads 3 more articles about the thing they want to do instead of doing it? Who replies to every low-priority email before opening the document that actually matters? That person is not lazy. They are busy. They are active. They may even feel productive, but they are procrastinating. Because everything they are doing, however useful it appears, is chosen specifically because it is not the thing that feels threatening. And that word, threatening, is important because it points to something that the simple "just do it" narrative completely misses. Procrastination, in most cases, is not a failure of desire. It is a fear response. And fear, like everything else we have discussed, is managed by the brain. Not the rational, reflective brain you think you're operating from, but the older, faster, more primal brain that evaluates every situation through a single lens. Is this safe? When a task feels difficult, uncertain, or tied to something that matters, a creative project, a health commitment, a difficult conversation, a financial decision, the brain flags it. Not as dangerous in the physical sense, but as potentially costly, potentially embarrassing, potentially painful, and so it nudges you, gently but persistently, towards something easier, something with a clearer outcome, something where the risk of failure is lower. The email, the kitchen, the task list, the research rabbit hole. These are not distractions. They are escapes that feel responsible, and they are chosen, unconsciously but reliably, every time the brain decides that the real task carries too much weight. Dr. Tim Feichel, one of the leading researchers on procrastination at Carleton University, has spent decades making this point with precision. Procrastination is an emotion regulation problem, not a time management problem. People do not procrastinate because they are bad at scheduling. They procrastinate because they are trying to avoid a feeling, discomfort, anxiety, self-doubt, boredom, fear of failure, fear of success, and the avoidance works in the short term. It provides immediate relief, and immediate relief, as we know, is exactly what the brain is wired to seek. This reframe changes everything, because if procrastination is about emotion, then the solution is not more discipline. It is not a stricter schedule. It is not a better app or a louder alarm. The solution is to change the emotional texture of the task itself, to reduce the threat it represents, to lower the stakes of beginning, to make the entry point feel safe enough that the brain stops sounding the alarm. And this is precisely what the 4 laws of behavior change, developed by James Clear, are designed to do. The first law, make it obvious. A task that is out of sight is out of mind, not metaphorically, but neurologically. What is not visible does not trigger action. If your running shoes are in the closet does not remind you to run. But if the shoes are next to the door does. Visibility is the first layer of activation. Before you can do something, your environment needs to remind you that it exists. The second law, make it attractive. The brain moves toward anticipated pleasure and away from anticipated discomfort. If a task is associated in your mind with strain, boredom, or failure, your nervous system will resist it automatically, long before you consciously decide anything. So the question is not how to force yourself through the resistance, but how to reframe the association. Pair the difficult task with something genuinely enjoyable, a specific playlist, a particular drink, a space that feels good to work in, a partner who shares the commitment. The task doesn't change, but the emotional forecast around it does. The third law, make it easy. This is perhaps the most underestimated of the 4. The size of the first step determines whether or not you take it. A habit that begins with 2 minutes is not a watered-down version of the real habit. It is a doorway. And doorways matter more than destinations, because you cannot reach the destination without first passing through the door. When you reduce the size of the starting action to something almost embarrassingly small, you remove the activation cost. You disarm the threat. The brain looks at 2 minutes and says, "Fine, that's safe." And once you are in motion, once the loop has started, Continuation is far easier than initiation was. The fourth law, make it satisfying. The brain learns through consequence. Behaviors that are followed by a sense of completion, reward, or progress are behaviors the brain wants to repeat. Behaviors that end in nothing, no signal, no acknowledgement, no closure, are behaviors the brain files away as unremarkable and forgettable. Tracking your progress, marking a day on a calendar, writing a single sentence in a log. These are not childish rituals. They are signals to the nervous system that something worth repeating just happened. Together, these four laws do something elegant. They do not demand more of you. They demand less, by making the right behavior easier to start, easier to continue, and easier to remember the next time. And here is what becomes clear when you apply them honestly. Most of the habits that have failed in your life did not fail because you lacked commitment. They failed because they violated one or more of these laws. Silently, invisibly, in the design of the habit itself. The goal was invisible. The task was unappealing. The entry point was too large. The reward was too distant. You were not the problem. The design was. Now, knowing this, knowing that procrastination is a signal, that the four laws are a design framework, that the environment can be engineered, a deeper question begins to surface. One that goes beyond technique and touches something more personal. What if the real barrier is not the habit itself, but the story you tell yourself about who you are? What if the most powerful force shaping your behavior is not your environment at all, but your identity? There is a question worth asking yourself right now. Not out loud, necessarily, but honestly, quietly. When you imagine the version of you that exercises consistently, eats thoughtfully, sleeps enough, reads instead of scrolls, shows up for the hard things, do you see that person as someone you are becoming? Or do you see them as someone fundamentally different from who you are? Because the answer to that question matters more than any habit system, any environmental redesign, any behavioral framework we have discussed so far. It matters more than the shoes by the door and the book on the pillow and the 2-minute rule. Because all of those things are downstream of something deeper, something that sits at the very center of how you move through the world. Your identity, not the identity you present to others, the one you carry privately, the quiet, persistent narrative you have built about yourself over decades of experience, about what kind of person you are, what you are capable of, what you deserve, and what you can realistically expect from yourself. That narrative is running in the background of every decision you make, every moment of hesitation, every abandoned plan, every time you got close to a real change and then, somehow, found your way back to the familiar version of yourself. James Clear argues that most people approach behavior change from the wrong direction entirely. They start with the outcome, lose 20 pounds, run a marathon, build a business, and work backward from there. They set the goal, define the plan, and try to summon the discipline to execute. And they fail, not because the goal was wrong, but because they never change the one thing that determines whether any goal survives contact with real life, the story they tell themselves about who they are. Clear calls this the difference between outcome-based habits and identity-based habits. And the distinction is everything. An outcome-based approach says, I want to run a marathon, so I will follow a training plan. An identity-based approach says, I am a runner, so I train, because that is what runners do. The behavior in both cases may look identical on day one, but under pressure, under fatigue, under the accumulated weight of a difficult week, the outcome-based person asks, is this worth it? The identity-based person doesn't ask. They already know the answer, because the answer is written into who they believe they are. Think about a person who is offered a cigarette at a party. The outcome-based quitter says, no, thank you, I am trying to quit. The identity-based quitter says, no, thank you, I don't smoke. On the surface, the words are similar, but underneath them, the entire internal architecture is different. One person is fighting a craving. The other is simply being consistent with themselves. Now, here is where this gets personal, and perhaps a little uncomfortable. By the time you reach your 40s, your identity has been forming for a long time. It has been shaped by what people told you when you were young, about your body, your intelligence, your potential, by the experiences that succeeded and the ones that didn't, by the patterns you repeated long enough that they started to feel like personality rather than habit, by the roles you stepped into, parent, professional, provider, caretaker, and the roles you quietly stepped away from. Some of that accumulated identity serves you beautifully. Some of it is simply old. Not wrong exactly, but outdated. A self-concept formed in a different season of life, running on autopilot in a life that has since changed considerably. And here is the thing about an outdated identity. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't say, I am a belief formed in 1987 that no longer applies. It simply shows up as resistance, as the quiet inner voice that says, you're not really a morning person. You've never been consistent with this. You know how this ends. That voice is not wisdom. It is history dressed up as prophecy. The process of change then is not just behavioral, it is narrative. It is the slow, deliberate work of casting votes. Clear's phrase, for a different version of yourself. Every time you do the thing, even imperfectly, even briefly, you are casting a vote. You are telling your nervous system, this is also who I am. And the nervous system, like any good record keeper, takes note. You don't need a perfect streak to shift your identity. You don't need to have already arrived at the person you want to become. You simply need to accumulate enough evidence, enough small, consistent actions that your brain begins to update the story. That the old narrative starts to loosen its grip. That the new one becomes, gradually, the default. This is not a fast process. And for someone who has spent years, perhaps decades, identifying as someone who is not particularly disciplined, not particularly consistent, not particularly healthy, the early stages can feel strange, almost like wearing clothes that don't quite fit yet. You are doing the behaviors, but you don't yet feel like the person who does them. That discomfort is not a signal to stop. It is a signal that the identity is in transition, that the old story and the new evidence are in negotiation. And if you keep casting votes, if you keep showing up, even modestly, even imperfectly, the new story wins, not because you forced it, but because you fed it. There is one more layer to this, one that connects everything we have discussed: environment, habits, automaticity, procrastination, identity, into a single, unified truth. And it has to do with time. Specifically, with the way small actions, compounded over time, produce outcomes that feel almost miraculous from the outside, but are, from the inside, simply the logical result of a system that was quietly working all along. The concept has a name, and once you understand it, truly understand it, not just intellectually, but viscerally, it changes how you relate to every day that feels like nothing is happening. Before I go further, and I promise what's coming next is worth staying for, I want to take just a moment. We are getting close to something important on this channel. A milestone that honestly means more than just a number. It means that what we are building here, real conversations, grounded in science, designed for people who are serious about living well, is actually reaching the people it was made for. So if you have watched this far, if this has made you think, or recognize something in yourself, or question something you thought you knew, I want to invite you to subscribe. It takes 1 second, and it means that the next time we go this deep on something that matters, you will be there for it. And I want to say something else. Every protocol, every framework, every piece of science shared on this channel is reviewed by a clinical pharmacist and researcher. This is not entertainment dressed up as health advice. This is the real work, done carefully, done honestly, done for people who deserve better than shortcuts and surface-level motivation. People like you, who have been around long enough to know that the quick fixes don't fix anything. who are looking for something that actually holds. All right, now, back to where we were. Because what I'm about to describe is the piece that most people never reach. The concept that reframes every slow day, every invisible week, every moment of doubt into something else entirely. There is a phenomenon in nature called the phase transition. Water, as it heats, shows almost no visible change for a long time. You can watch it sitting in the pot, still, flat, apparently unmoved, and nothing seems to be happening. The temperature climbs from 50 degrees to 80 to 95. The water looks exactly the same. Still, quiet, unchanged. And then, at 100 degrees, everything shifts at once. The entire surface breaks open. The transformation that seemed not to be happening was happening the entire time, invisibly, at the molecular level, suddenly becomes undeniable. This is what James Clear calls the plateau of latent potential. And it is, in his own words, the graveyard of good habits. Because most people quit during the quiet stretch. They do the work for weeks, sometimes months, and see nothing. No visible result, no dramatic change, no confirmation that any of it is actually working. And so, they conclude that it isn't. That they aren't cut out for this. That the system doesn't apply to them. And they stop, just before the water begins to boil. This is not a metaphor chosen for inspiration. It is a structural description of how biological and behavioral change actually works. Consider bone density. When someone begins a resistance training program, the bones begin to respond, generating new tissue, increasing mineral density, weeks before any external measurement would show a significant difference. The change is real. It is happening at the cellular level, but it is invisible to every tool available to the person doing the work. If they measure too early and see nothing and stop, they will never know how close they were. Consider the learning of a language. For weeks, sometimes months, a new learner feels as though nothing is sticking. Words fade, grammar tangles, conversations collapse, and then, sometimes without warning, something opens. The ear starts to catch meaning before the mind translates it. Patterns emerge that were invisible before. The plateau breaks, and the person who stayed long enough to reach that moment will tell you, "I almost quit 2 weeks before it clicked." The same is true for every habit you have tried to build. Every morning routine that felt mechanical and pointless for the first 3 weeks. Every dietary change that seemed to produce no result for the first month. Every meditation practice that felt like sitting still for nothing. The results were accumulating. The neural pathways were strengthening. The identity was quietly, incrementally shifting. But none of it had crossed the threshold of visibility yet. And visibility, for the human brain, is confirmation. Without it, we doubt. Without confirmation, we stop. This is why the 4 laws, particularly making the behavior satisfying, are not optional extras. They are structural necessities. Because in the absence of visible external results, the brain needs internal signals to stay the course. The calendar marked, the log updated, the small ritual completed. These things are not vanity. They are the feedback loop that keeps the system running while the deeper work remains underground. And there is something worth naming directly here, for anyone over 40 who is listening. At this stage of life, you have a relationship with time that younger people simply do not have. You have watched enough cycles of motivation and collapse, of starting and stopping, of believing and doubting, to know how this story usually goes. And that knowledge is a double-edged thing. It makes you wiser. It also makes you more vulnerable to the voice that says, "I know how this ends." But here is what that voice doesn't know. It doesn't know that this time, you understand the mechanism. It doesn't know that you are no longer relying on willpower or motivation or the right mood or the perfect conditions. It doesn't know that you have redesigned the environment, stacked the habits, reduced the friction, and begun casting votes for a different identity. It doesn't know that you know about the plateau, and that you intend to stay. Because staying, not heroically, not dramatically, but quietly and consistently, is the entire game. The people who transform their health, their energy, their bodies, their minds after 40 are not the ones who found the perfect program. They are the ones who stopped quitting during the quiet stretch. They learned to read silence not as failure, but as depth. And that shift in reading, that reinterpretation of the invisible, is what separates the person who arrives from the person who almost did. There is a mathematical concept that, on paper, looks almost too simple to be significant. Start with 1 penny. Double it every day for 30 days. On day 5, you have 16 cents. On day 10, $5.12. By day 15, you are just over $300. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that would make you stop and pay attention. But on day 30, the final day of that same quiet, unspectacular doubling, you have $536 million. The number didn't explode on day 30. It was always going to be that number. The trajectory was set on day 1. What looked like nothing, for most of the journey, was always becoming something extraordinary. The math was always true. The human eye simply couldn't see it yet. This is compounding. And while most people understand it as a financial principle, it is, perhaps more profoundly, a biological one, a behavioral one, a principle that governs the quiet transformation happening inside every person who decides, for the last time, to stop starting over. James Clear writes that a 1% improvement every day compounds to a result that is 37 times better over the course of a year. 1%, the kind of improvement so small that on any given day it is genuinely invisible. The kind of improvement that feels, in the moment, like almost nothing. But compounded, stacked day upon day, week upon week, in the same direction, it produces outcomes that seem, from the outside, like sudden transformation, like talent, like luck. They are neither. They are arithmetic made flesh. Now think about what this means for the habits you are building. The 2-minute meditation, the single page of reading, the walk after dinner, the glass of water before coffee, the moment of stillness before the phone. None of these feel significant in isolation. None of them produce a measurable result today. But each one is a deposit. Each one is a vote. Each one is a fraction of a degree of course correction. And over distance, a fraction of a degree becomes an entirely different destination. The person who stretches for 5 minutes every morning for 2 years does not simply have more flexible hamstrings. They have built a body that moves differently. They have a nervous system that has learned to greet the morning with intention rather than inertia. They have a self-concept that includes, quietly but firmly, the belief that they are someone who takes care of their body. The stretch was never just a stretch. It was infrastructure. And here is something that deserves to be said plainly, because it is often glossed over in the enthusiasm for habit science. Compounding works in both directions. The habits that quietly erode you compound just as reliably as the ones that build you. The nightly drink that becomes 2. The sedentary afternoon that becomes a sedentary life. The small cynicism that becomes a worldview. The skipped checkup, the ignored symptom, the deferred conversation, the postponed decision. Each one is also a deposit. Into a different account, toward a different destination. This is not said to generate fear. It is said because, at a certain point in life, the compounding of neglect becomes visible in ways that are harder to ignore. The body that was forgiving at 30 is more honest at 45. The energy that was abundant in your 30s starts to feel like a resource that requires management. The sleep that you sacrificed for years begins to present its invoice. And the question is not whether you notice this. Most people do. The question is what you do with the noticing. Because there are 2 responses available. The first is to feel overwhelmed. To see the distance between where you are and where you want to be as evidence that it is too late, too far, too hard. The second is to recognize that compounding doesn't care how late you start. It cares only that you start and that you continue. There is research on this that is worth knowing. Studies on neuroplasticity have consistently shown that the brain retains a remarkable capacity for structural change well into middle age and beyond. New habits formed at 50 can become as deeply grooved as habits formed at 20. They may take longer to establish, require more deliberate repetition, demand a more carefully designed environment. But they form. They hold. The brain does not close at 40. It adapts more slowly, perhaps, but it adapts. The same is true of the body. Muscle mass can be built at 60. Cardiovascular fitness can be dramatically improved at 55. Cognitive function can be supported and enhanced through deliberate habits at any age at which you are still alive and willing. The biology is not fixed. The trajectory is not sealed. The compound effect is available to you right now, today, with whatever you have and wherever you are. But, and this is the part that requires honesty, it requires a particular kind of patience that our culture does not celebrate. Not the passive patience of waiting, the active patience of continuing, of showing up on the days that feel pointless, of trusting the math when the mirror hasn't caught up yet, of understanding that the plateau is not a verdict, but a delay. The people who have transformed their health and their lives at 40, 50, 60, they will not tell you it happened quickly. They will not describe a dramatic turning point or a single revelation. They will tell you, almost uniformly, about a decision to stop requiring evidence before continuing, to let the system run without constant auditing, to trust the direction more than the speed. They learned, in other words, to become comfortable being in process, not almost there, not nearly done, just in it, committed to the direction, unattached to the timeline. And there is a quiet freedom in that, a freedom that the goal-obsessed, result-hungry, before and after culture almost never talks about, the freedom of simply being someone who does the thing, not someone who is trying to do the thing, not someone who will do the thing when conditions improve, someone who does it, because that is who they are now. That shift, from trying to being, is the final frontier, and it is closer than you think. There is a version of you that exists only in private. Not the version that shows up to meetings, or answers messages, or performs competence and composure for an audience. Not the version that is patient with other people's problems or articulate about its own values. The private version. The one that exists at 11 o'clock at night when the day is done and the house is quiet and there is no one left to be anything for. That version of you. What does it do? Not what do you wish it did. Not what you intend for it to do once things settle down and life gets less complicated. What does it actually do right now, in the absence of external accountability, in the absence of anyone watching or measuring or expecting anything at all? Because that private version, that unperformed, unwitnessed, unsupervised version of yourself, is the truest measure of where your identity actually lives. Not your goals. Not your values as you would articulate them in a conversation. Not the habits you are planning to start. The ones you are already running. Automatically. Invisibly. When no one is keeping score. This is not a judgment. It is a diagnostic. Because here is what is worth understanding. The gap between your public intentions and your private behavior is not a moral gap. It is an identity gap. It is the distance between the person you consciously aspire to be and the person your nervous system has been trained to default to. And closing that gap, not through force, not through shame, not through heroic self-improvement, but through the quiet, patient redesign of your defaults, is the real work of behavioral change. Think about the people you have known in your life who seemed genuinely disciplined, not the ones who perform discipline loudly, who announced their early mornings and their cold showers and their caloric precision, the quietly consistent ones, the ones who, year after year, simply looked after themselves, who moved their bodies and slept enough and ate with some degree of care and showed up to the things that mattered. If you asked them their secret, most of them would not have one, or rather, their secret would be embarrassingly mundane. They would describe routines so ordinary they border on boring. They would tell you that they don't find it particularly difficult anymore, that it simply feels like what they do. And that is the thing. That is the entire thing. They have closed the gap. Their private behavior has aligned with their stated values, not through constant effort and vigilance, but because the values eventually migrated downward, from the conscious aspiration into the automatic default. The identity caught up with the intention. The nervous system updated its model of who this person is. And then the behaviors that once required willpower began to require almost nothing at all. This is the destination that all of the frameworks we have discussed are pointing toward. Not a perfect life, not an optimized schedule or a flawless morning routine, just alignment, coherence between who you say you are and what you actually do when no one is watching, between the person you present and the person you inhabit. And here is something that tends to surprise people when they get close to this kind of coherence. It doesn't feel like triumph. It doesn't feel like the finish line of a long race with crowds and banners and a clear sense of having arrived. It feels quiet, almost ordinary, because the behaviors are no longer dramatic. They are simply what you do. The friction is gone. The internal negotiation has ended. And in its place is something that is very easy to overlook because it does not announce itself. Peace. Quiet, unremarkable, deeply sustainable peace. Not the peace of having nothing to work on, but the peace of being someone who works on things, consistently, honestly, without the exhausting overhead of constant self-persuasion. The peace of a life that is moving in the direction you chose, at a pace you can maintain, through a system that doesn't require you to be perfect to function. This matters enormously for anyone in their 40s, 50s, or beyond. Because at this stage of life, the cost of internal conflict is not abstract. You feel it in your energy levels, in the quality of your sleep, in the background hum of low-grade dissatisfaction that follows you when your actions and your values are chronically out of alignment. The body keeps score of that distance. The nervous system runs hotter when it is constantly negotiating between what you intend and what you do. Alignment is not just a psychological nicety. It is a physiological one. And so the question that becomes relevant, the practical, honest, grounded question, is not, how do I become more disciplined? It is, which one behavior, if I made it truly automatic, would bring my daily life into greatest alignment with who I want to be? Just one. Not a list, not a program, not a complete reinvention. One behavior, one vote, cast consistently, in private, when no one is watching. Because transformation, real transformation, the kind that holds, the kind that compounds, the kind that eventually becomes invisible because it has simply become you, never begins with a grand gesture. It begins with a single, unwitnessed moment of integrity. A moment when the private version of you makes the same choice the public version said it would. And then another, and then another. Until one day, without fanfare, without a before and after photograph, without a single motivational phrase, the two versions are the same person. That is the quiet revolution that all of this has been building toward. Not the discipline you perform, the discipline you become. And there is one final thing left to say. One thread that runs beneath everything we have discussed, beneath the neuroscience and the behavioral frameworks and the identity shifts and the compounding, that when you finally see it clearly makes the whole picture land differently. There is a moment that almost no one talks about, not the moment you decide to change. Everyone talks about that one. The resolution, the declaration, the fresh start, the renewed commitment. That moment gets celebrated, shared, photographed, announced. The moment no one talks about is quieter, less visible. It happens somewhere in the middle of an ordinary day, in an ordinary week, when nothing particularly significant is occurring. You are moving through your routine, the one you designed, the one you stacked, the one you have been showing up for without drama or applause. And you realize, almost by accident, that you are not thinking about it anymore. You just did the thing, without negotiating, without convincing yourself, without checking whether you felt like it. The behavior happened the way breathing happens, the way balance happens when you walk, automatically, effortlessly, as if it could not have gone any other way. And in that moment, if you are paying attention, you will feel something subtle. Not pride. Exactly. Not satisfaction in the way a completed goal produces satisfaction. Something quieter than that. Something that feels, if you had to name it, like recognition. Like meeting yourself somewhere you have been trying to reach for a long time. Like arriving somewhere that somehow feels familiar. That is not an accident. That is identity. Finally catching up with intention. Everything we have walked through together. The neuroscience of a brain designed for survival, not aspiration. The fragility of willpower under the weight of a real life. The profound, underestimated power of environment to shape behavior without a single act of conscious decision-making. The elegance of habit stacking, borrowing momentum from what already works to carry what is newly wanted. The 4 laws that transform the design of behavior from an act of force into an act of architecture. The plateau that looks like failure but is actually depth. The compounding that looks like nothing until it looks like everything. The identity that shifts not through declaration but through accumulated evidence. The private version of yourself, slowly, quietly becoming the same person as the one you say you want to be. All of it, every layer of it, was pointing here. To this moment, this ordinary, unremarkable, quietly extraordinary moment when the work disappears into the person, when the system becomes the self. And here is what I want to leave you with. Not a formula, not a checklist, not another framework to add to the collection. Just this. You have been harder on yourself than the evidence warrants. The times you failed to stay consistent, that was not weakness. That was a person trying to do the right thing with the wrong tools. The guilt you carried about starting over, that was not deserved. That was a human brain behaving exactly as it was designed to behave, in an environment that was never designed to support you. You were not losing a character contest. You were running the wrong software on the right hardware. And now you know, not just intellectually. Something deeper than that. The kind of knowing that settles into the body, that changes what feels possible, that makes the gap between who you are and who you want to be look less like a verdict and more like a project. A patient, unglamorous, deeply worthwhile project. The person you are becoming is not waiting for you at the end of a dramatic transformation. They are not on the other side of a perfect streak or a flawless month or the right moment or the right season of life. They are assembling themselves right now in the small choices you make when no one is watching. In the vote you cast today, and tomorrow, and the day after. Not because you have to, but because you finally understand that this is how it works. That there is no other way. That the shortcut was always the slow road. Taken consistently. There is a version of your life, 5 years from now, that looks remarkably different from today. Not because something dramatic happened, not because you found the perfect system or the perfect motivation or the perfect moment to begin, but because somewhere, perhaps today, perhaps after watching this, you stopped waiting for discipline to arrive and started building the conditions in which it becomes inevitable. That version of your life is not a fantasy. It is a projection of today's choices, compounded forward. It is arithmetic. It is biology. It is already in motion, whether you are steering it or not. The only question is whether you are the one doing the designing. I want to ask you something before you go. Not a rhetorical question, a real one. What is the one behavior, just one, that, if you made it truly automatic over the next 6 months, would change the trajectory of your health, your energy, your life in the most meaningful way? Write it in the comments. Not for me, for you. Because the act of naming it, of putting it in writing, of making it visible, that is already the first vote. That is already the beginning of the evidence your nervous system needs. And if this conversation reached something real in you, if something here cracked open a perspective that had been closed for a while, share it. Not with everyone. With 5 people specifically. 5 people you know who are serious about their health, their longevity, their quality of life. 5 people who deserve to hear this instead of another quick fix. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, because this is what we do here. No noise, no performance, no shortcuts dressed up as science. Just the real work, done carefully, for people who are ready to do it. and tell me, what do you want us to go deep on next? I'll be here,